listener production.
A warning. This episode contains graphic descriptions of sexual assault and violence against women. If this content does affect you, the number for Lifeline is 13 11 14. I'm former police officer Brent Sanders, and for the past 25 years, I've dedicated myself to sharing what I've learnt on the force to the Australian public so they can better protect themselves from falling victim to crime. So with the help of some of the most respected current and former detectives and high-ranking law enforcement agents, we're going to pull back the curtain on what life is like on the force and what they've learned about how crime and criminals really work. These are real stories from real detectives.
Hey little mate, what do you reckon you'll be when you grow up?
As a child, Craig Doran dreamt of being a detective. His dream became a reality as he served 22 years in the Queensland Police. A growing frustration with how long it took to bring organised criminals to justice led to him establishing Comtrac in 2016. The firm now employs 35 people, with the company's annual turnover approaching $10 million. The firm is valued at as much as $100 million. We'll get to Craig and Comtrac in the second half of our chat. But first, Craig, you worked on a case involving a man who travelled the world issuing false bank guarantees.
Yeah, so that was a really interesting case. I've always had a real passion for fraud investigations. I mean, there's $2.7 billion worth of fraud gets lost every year in Australia, and those perpetrators, I kind of think they're probably one of the worst offenders out there. But this was a really interesting one because this was a guy, he was from South Africa, like originally, his name was Botha, and we got a communication from the FBI in the US who said that they've identified he'd moved down the Gold Coast, and you need to keep an eye on him because he keeps moving countries. As soon as he thinks the police or someone's investigating him, he will just take flight and he will leave behind houses, cars, and just vanish. He's made over 50 million US up until then over about a 5-year period, and he was in our area. And it came in just as more of an intelligence bulletin, but I thought it sounded really interesting because the concept of what he was doing, he was selling what they referred to as bank guarantees. Bank guarantees is kind of like a security that someone will get to then go and get a much larger loan. The banks will issue these things, but you've got to put up the assets and the cash to say if you've got a $100 million bank guarantee, then you've got to have $100 million worth of assets to get it. And then you take that guarantee to get a loan from anywhere. His scam was basically that he had set up a bank called the Anchor Pacific Bank, which was very closely titled to a real European bank called the Anchor Bank. And he was basically communicating through different circles that for anywhere between $100,000 to say $500,000, he could issue you a bank guarantee between $10 million or $100 million, and he would issue it from the Anchor Pacific Bank. He did actually have a banking license, but it was from the island of Nauru, which had listed about something like 10,000 banks, and in reality, Nauru doesn't really export anything except for, I think it's seagull dung or something like that. So the government there creates his banking license, and you buy it for about 10,000. So it seemed like a really interesting investigation or an intelligence bulletin. So I did a quick search on this individual's name, and straight away there was a complaint was on the system. There was a guy called, I think his name was Brian Gray, who had put in a complaint. Now, Brian Gray, most people won't remember, but he was the founder and the CEO of an airline called Compass Airlines, which was started in Australia some time ago, and it went bust. And Brian wanted to start up another airline, and of course he was looking for funding, and somehow he'd got tied up with this gentleman called Botha, and he had been seeking a $100 million bank guarantee and paid about $500,000 for it. So straight away we had a complaint, and the thing that rang in my ears was the FBI going, as soon as he knows you're onto him, he will go. He will leave behind homes, houses, cars, and just take off. So we knew that before we made the arrest, we had to prepare like an objection to bail so that once we made the arrest, we could keep him locked up whilst we actually undertook our investigation, which is a little bit of a flip on how you normally approach these things, right? So we went and took the statement off Brian Gray, decided we had enough for a prima facie arrest, and we went out, we tracked Botha down the Gold Coast. I think he was down at Carrara, had a mansion there where he's living out of, and we went and made our arrest and objected to bail. Brought him back to the watch house. It was early in the morning, which means he wouldn't go to court until the afternoon. We spoke to the prosecutor from the DPP, and the DPP told us then that they weren't going to object to bail because they didn't think the FBI bulletin was enough. And we tried to convince him if he gets out, he's gone. And there's possibly multiples of complaints in Australia and overseas that are looking for some sort of justice on this. They said, well, look, if he's going to court this afternoon, you better get some more. The FBI bulletin's not going to be enough. So as it turned out, there was a guy called Randy Camps, which is his real name. He was an American gentleman who actually was one of Botha's brokers, but Brian Gray had said, Randy will talk to you guys because he knows that Brian's made a complaint. Randy was worried that he was going to get arrested as well. So we raced down the Gold Coast, found Randy Camps, took a statement off him. Randy talked about seeing all these false passports with Botha's image in it, knew about the scam. He denies he was part of the scam, but said he believes there was something untowards there. So we got a statement showing that Botha had access to funds, but also false passports, because the DPP were going to say they're just going to ask for his passport and then they were going to give him bail, and that would make him not a flight risk. And we knew that wasn't the case. So we went down, got a statement, rushed all the way back to court, got to court just in the nick of time, gave the prosecutor that statement. He ummed and ahed. In the meantime, our inspector had actually got in contact with the Director of Public Prosecutions, told him the story, said, you've got to tell your prosecutor to oppose bail. And we went through that process, it got put forward, and the bail was opposed from that first hearing, which means we had at least a few weeks before he could try and get bail again. And that's sort of where it all started, where we realised that in the next 3 to 4 weeks, this guy was going to do everything he could to get out. He had the money, he had the means, he had the resources to do it. So time was really on the clock for us for this. I remember at the end of the bail objection hearing, the defence lawyer walked out and he looked at us and he said, you guys better get ready for a shit fight because we're going as far as we can with this. And I always thought he seemed really upset about it. And most defence lawyers are very poised. They know what their roles in the game. We later found out this particular defence lawyer had some commercial interest with Botha as well. He was also tied up in a different part, which I won't go into. So that's how it all started. And from there, the race was against the clock to start getting witnesses and statements and evidence together because we knew that he was going to take this to the District Court for appeal, then the Supreme Court, and then the High Court, because all he wanted to do was get out so he could take off. We also identified one of Botha's brokers who was in Johannesburg in South Africa, because the FBI report said this person might want to speak to you. He's heavily involved, but he might not. So we made some contact with the Johannesburg fraud squad, and we contacted a Superintendent, Gordon Duguid. I remember him really, really well because I remember having a phone call with Superintendent Duguid, and I said, look, we want to see if you can find this guy and pick him up and interview him about what he knows, because we're trying to keep this fellow Botha in custody. I said to him, look, I think there's a fair chance that this fellow, Christian LaRue, who was the broker, he probably will, I suspect he'll refuse to speak with you. And I remember Gordon Duguid, and of course this is my word South African voice, he said, what do you mean refuse to speak to me? He cannot refuse to speak to me. And it's then I realised that perhaps the common law rights weren't quite as well spread across South Africa as they were here, and the right to silence was not really an option. And true to his word, the next day we got a call from this superintendent, said, I've got him, he's ready to talk, come in. Of course, back then there was no Zoom or Teams meetings, all that sort of stuff. So we had to go down to Australian Customs, and we had to go to this massive room where they had a satellite link up. And then we actually did our interview with this Christian LaRue, the broker, and to the right of him was Gordon Duguid, and to the left of him was Gordon Duguid's partner. And we went through this interview, and Christian LaRue just confessed to everything. This is what we do. They're fraudulent documents. I round up investors, convince them it's a real bank. They'll pay money. We issue this fraudulent bank guarantee. Then when they complain, we say, well, no, you have to get the assets. Then we'll go get your real one. So the interview went really well. We had all the evidence we need to really firm up our case. And then I asked Christian LaRue, I said, would you be willing to come to Australia to be a part of the trial and the hearing? And he sat there and then he looked to Superintendent Dogood and he said, yes, I'm willing to come across, but only as long as Superintendent Dogood and his partner can accompany me as well. And we need to stay on the Gold Coast in Surfers Paradise for the duration of the trip. And I remember him looking at Superintendent Dogood and he gave him a look and just went, right on script, buddy. So obviously they'd schooled him up to make sure they got a trip as well. So that's where it began. And of course, during this process, over the next 3 months, there was bail hearings to the Supreme Court, all the way through to the High Court, and they kept going one after the other, and we just kept on collecting evidence all the way. So instead of the normal course of building a brief of evidence to go to court in, we were literally building a brief of evidence just to oppose bail, because we knew that once he was gone, if he got bail, he was gone. And that's sort of how it rolled out. And then once the High Court ruled that he was locked up, I think we had a committal hearing after that, and then he pretty much just pleaded guilty because he knew that was it. He knew there was no point. He wasn't going to spend all his money on a criminal lawyer, and he knew that he was going to go to jail anyway. And so he ended up pleading guilty, having an early review. We seized a lot of assets, houses, cash in bank, and we were successfully the first country to ever prosecute this individual. And he'd been wanted in the UK, Sweden, the US, and I think he did about 8 years. And at the end of that, I think he got extradited by the next country who was lining up to take him for those charges as well.
And so in the end of all of this, you ended up successfully prosecuting him for the case where Brian Gray, the ex-Compass owner of Compass Airlines, he was the complainant, and it was that one case that you're unable to get him put away.
Yeah, look, we end up getting some complaint statements from other investors as well. There was a couple in the US, one in Singapore. So we ended up having, I think, about 7 charges against him in the end, because they all started, once one heard about, then someone told somebody else, and then obviously we advised the FBI, and they obviously passed the message to some of the people who had complained to them. So we ended up having about 7 or 8 complainants, and I think it was for about $12 million in these fraudulent bank guarantees.
That's a great, getting a conviction under those circumstances is a good end result. Getting 8 years, that's a real win, isn't it?
Yeah, that's a good point, because one thing about fraud investigations, they just don't seem to attract the penalties that other offences do. I mean, someone might commit a fraud scam on, say, 4 or 5 retirees and take all their life savings, $300,000-$400,000 each, and they'll get like a 2-year sentence. And then someone might do a robbery of a convenience store and take, $50 and a carton of cigarettes, and they'll get 7 years. Yeah, so it was a really good result, but it was quite a unique sort of investigation in its own making.
And it wouldn't be too common for the Queensland Fraud Squad to be in connection or communication with the FBI. That's quite unique too, isn't it? That it was that sort of notation from the FBI that sort of first sparked your interest in this case.
Yeah, look, I think it was, I don't remember the name of the investigator from the FBI, but I had the feeling that he was always quite passionate about it. I think Botha was one of those ones that he thought, well, this one got away, and it just irritated him. So I think he tried to keep tabs on where he was moving to and always looking for him. And then when he found out where he was, he just took a chance, did up a bulletin, sent it through Interpol, who then sent it to us. I think it came through back on a fax, because we had faxes back then, right? And I think I just picked it up off the fax and went, oh, well, this is interesting.
Goodness, what a wonderful cast. Randy Camps, Gordon Dogood, and Kristen LaRue. You couldn't actually script that any better yourself, could you?
If you're going to cast Randy Camps, I'm not sure he was an unusual character. Yeah, he was just, I'm not sure how to describe Randy, but...
I think his name may do that for him, just quietly.
Yeah, that's for sure, yeah.
Just on that too, you mentioned it was going to be a question I asked. You go away for something like this. Botha goes away, does his time, but there's obviously a queue of international or potential other cases, likely convictions. So he comes out of prison. He'd be put straight into a extraditionary type situation and flown into somewhere else. And to your knowledge, now here we are chatting about this 25 years afterwards. Did he do a stretch anywhere else, like back in the States or anything following that extradition?
Look, to be honest with you, I don't really know. I remember asking the question to someone once about who was still in the police, and they thought that he did get he got extradited back to the US. I think the thing to understand is that what we charged him with, even though some of the victims were overseas, the offences we charged him with for those overseas victims, they had to have been committed partly in Australia. So we couldn't prosecute him for anything that happened when he was in the US or he was in the UK or Singapore. He had to be in Australia and doing something that formed part of that offence whilst he was here. So we did prosecute him for some of those overseas ones. And after 8 years, in today's cycle, things just get forgotten. People just forget. Whether he did get extradited, I can't say 100%. I would like to have thought that he was. But, in the cycle of everything these days, I mean, you guys know in the news cycle, it's gone in a week out of everyone's mind, except for the victims, of course. So
You do wonder, a bloke like this, don't you, that leopard doesn't change its spots, and he did a stretch here. He might have done a bit of a stretch elsewhere, but here we are 25 years down the track. It's always interesting to think where he is now, under what identity and what he's up to. And, great story.
Look, we would have only recovered a fraction of the money that he had taken over the years. And he had in offshore accounts and hidden assets and all sorts of things. He was one of those typical fraud offenders that they really didn't think they were doing anything wrong. His defence was that he did have a banking licence, which was technically correct in the from the metropolis of Nauru, and he did issue a bank guarantee, but he had this caveat that was like an interim bank guarantee until the victims actually then went and got all the assets to give to him so that he can go and get a real bank guarantee. And he was adamant that that's what his business was and that they all knew that. So, and a lot of fraud offenders are like that. Especially when they've got these schemes, it's always everyone else's fault but theirs, and everyone else has got it wrong. I remember when I was at the fraud squad, we used to have the saying that the fraud squad was basically, we used to protect the greedy and not so clever from the greedy and very clever. And that was often the case. A lot of victims, unfortunately, are jumping into things which looks like it's an easy pathway to fame and fortune, or it's just a quick rich scheme, or it's a investment you can't pass up, and they just get suckered into it, unfortunately.
And as you so rightly say, Craig, that the Bothas of this world would view it that the only crime that they've committed is they were just a little bit smarter and ahead of the curve than those that they got the money off.
Well, yeah, or the only crime they committed is that they allowed themselves to get caught.
Well, yeah, at that point, yeah. Look, that's a great insight, mate, and quite a, we look at fraud, and people look at fraud and things like presenting false bank guarantees. It sounds a little bit dry, but you get into these investigations, and like you say, there's real people involved, real characters, and it's a really good insight. Coming up, how and why Craig created a platform using AI that makes investigating crime and creating briefs of evidence much simpler, enabling police, business and governments to bring people to justice. Craig, having left the job in around 2016, there or thereabouts, you founded a software company called Comtrac, which now employs over 30 staff. Can you just discuss the origins of this and what Comtrac does?
When I moved down to Brisbane, I started working through your various major crime units, like I guess your drug squads, fraud squads, your organised crime unit, and so on. And I'd worked there for about 10 years. I had about 22 years overall in the police. But one of the things that I found is that when we were doing those major investigations, we were gathering a lot of information over maybe a 3-month or a 6-month period, and then we'd make an arrest, and then we were practically offline for anywhere between 3 to 6 months building briefs of evidence. And the reason for that was that when we were running our investigations, we had nowhere to really put the evidence, except for sticking it in a file server and a folder. At some point, we're going to come back and look through it, and then we're going to build our brief evidence. And because the world had evolved a lot, even back about 2010, 2011, I tried to get our IT section to build us what we called an e-brief, an electronic brief of evidence. I said, we need something that as we take a witness statement, or as we do an interview, or as we get a photograph, or as we get some sort of an analysis sample, we want to basically put it into a system, map the evidence to the elements of the offence, and then automatically build that brief evidence as we progress through the investigation. Because if we don't, then suddenly the whole criminal justice process is just delayed. Like once we make our arrests, we're supposed to get our brief evidence to the court as soon as possible so they can commence proceedings. But it ended up being months and months, and there was adjournment and there was adjournment. And then, of course, because we weren't really working around proving the elements of the offence, we're just, let's prove the offence, the prosecution was always going, hey, you're missing this or you're missing that. So I want our IT department to build us a platform that as we've got evidence, we can map it to the points of proof for what we're trying to prove, and it would build this brief evidence automatically, and we could see what was proven or not proven, because that would give us a real strategic direction for the case, our lines of inquiry. It would give us a 360 transparency of the case. So as it turned out, they did actually say, that sounds like a great idea, and they gave me one IT person, and he tried to build something in Microsoft Access for us. And it just went nowhere. And in saying that, like they had committees around this, there was a lot of buy-in for it. And at one point, I just went, this is just not going to happen. As a government agency, we just don't seem to have the drive to do it. And then I thought, you know what, I'm going to have a crack at this. This just makes so much sense. I mean, I could turn a 6-month investigation into maybe 3-month investigation, or I could take 6 to 12 months of brief preparation and have a whole brief ready in a week or two after the arrest. I thought, surely this makes sense. So I decided to take some time off. I ended up resigning because I really got passionate about it. And of course, one of the mistakes I made was if you are an entrepreneur with a really good idea, if you want to survive and build it really rapidly, your client base must not be government because they do not move very fast at all. The procurement cycles are long. They're very risk adverse. No one wants to try anything really new and exciting. So we spent about 2 years building this prototype of our e-brief, our electronic brief evidence, a platform that as investigators were putting their statements in, it was building this brief automatically. And then I was at a conference, so I think it was Environmental Regulators Conference, and I gave a presentation on this prototype that we'd done. And then I got approached by New South Wales Mine Safety because they do investigations into work health and safety legislation. One thing to keep in mind, criminal investigations are not limited to just police forces, right? You've got your environment protection agencies, your race integrity commissions, your health government agencies, transport. They all have legislation they administer, and if people breach that legislation, then they can get charged in criminal. So they've all done it. So we had New South Wales Mine Safety go, it looks like a great idea, let's do it. And that was kind of like 10 years ago. And they were our first client, and they are still with us today. And since then, we have rolled out our platform out across Commonwealth, state government agencies, a couple of small overseas APAC law enforcement agencies, and we end up having we've got about 34 clients on the books now. But the one thing that always eluded me were the police departments. Of course, the vision for me was for police, right? It was my background. When I left the police, I had no problem with it. I loved working in the police. I really enjoyed it, but I just had this idea that I was sure it was going to work. And I guess it wasn't until, it was early 2024, or maybe late 2023, we'd started applying AI across our platform. And the best way to describe it is at the core of our platform is something called the investigation matrix. In its earlier version, the investigators would link an exhibit to an element of the offence, and they would actually describe what is the evidence in that exhibit that proves that element. So they still had to do that manually. And from that point on, then our software was building this brief evidence automatically in the background. It's mapping the evidence, linking the witnesses, building the briefs, even convert all the exhibits to PDF and create a hard copy file or electronic one. In late 2023, we decided to put AI services across our investigation matrix, which meant instead of the investigator looking through a witness statement or a 100-page transcript or 1,000 pages of financial records or body-worn camera video, whatever the case may be, we got the AI services to look through it. And we train the AI service and when you train it, you're basically teaching it, you are an investigator who works for law enforcement government agency. This is your role. Find evidence to prove the elements of the offence, create summary narratives, and help me build this brief evidence. So we spent a good 6 months sort of configuring and training this AI model. Then we ran it across our investigations, and then we started talking to clients, and everyone got really excited. So this is going to save thousands of hours. And then, as it turns out, the Queensland Police had heard about what we were doing. Now, they had another unique problem, which was focused on domestic violence. In the same way that I always thought about, we take too long to build brief evidence, the police were going out to domestic violence incidents. They were recording the conversations between the respondent and the aggrieved and police on their body-worn cameras. Then they had to come back to the station, and they were spending anywhere from 3 to 4 hours going through their notes, going through the body-worn camera video, typing up a domestic violence application, which was quite specific. There was certain things they had to put in that application to meet the legislative requirements, evidence requirements, to allow the courts to take out a domestic violence order. And of course, if it's taking you 3 or 4 hours to do that back at the station, the reality is if you're out the scene for an hour, you got 3 or 4 hours of paperwork, and then you have to serve something, your whole shift is gone. And the police were finding that their frontline capacity was being smashed. Most crews were going to 1, if not 2 domestic violence incidents a shift. They weren't being able to respond to other matters. There are some areas. I saw an article in the Courier Mail about Logan, who someone had leaked a screenshot showing 40-odd, I think, domestic violence incidents the police had just not been able to get to. So the Queensland Police approached us and said, we've heard what you're doing with AI around briefs of evidence. Could you do this for our domestic violence applications? And of course we said, well, yeah, we can. It's like we just tell our AI service that you are building a domestic violence application. This is what you need to look for. So now instead of them doing 3 or 4 hours building these particular domestic violence applications, they come back to the station, we import the body-worn camera footage into Comtrac. The AI will go across, say, 2 hours of body-worn camera video, and in 30 seconds, it will build that domestic violence application, which means the officer just now has to go through it and read it. And there are a few protocols built in the software they have to accept and understand that AI is there to assist but not replace, and they have to acknowledge that they've been through it. But in reality, they turned about 3 or 4 hours of work into maybe 15 to 20 minutes. So it's like a 75 to 80% increase in how efficient they are. There have been so many articles about, and not just Queensland Police, almost every state, where their frontline capacity is really stretched. Their attrition rate of police is getting higher and higher. Some states like Victoria have about 2,000 vacant positions. The problem is, if you're going to fix that frontline capacity, you've either got to employ hundreds of more police or thousands more police, or you have to find a way to do things more efficient. And we did a proof of concept with the Queensland Police. They ran live trials of this software, and only finished late last year, so it hasn't been deployed across the state or anything yet, and certainly we're still going through negotiations in that space. But the reality is, if we can make frontline police, say, 40% more efficient, if you've got a frontline uniform capacity of, say, 9,000 police, that's the equivalent to putting about another 3,000-something police on the road on the hours that they save. So instead of trying to fix frontline capacity with employing more police, if you just work smarter and be more efficient, then you can fix that problem in a way that you couldn't have dreamed of just by employing more police. So it's a really exciting time for us. The proof of concept went so well, I got invited down to Victoria, where I gave a presentation to assistant commissioners from every state in Australia and New Zealand about the work that we've done with the Queensland Police. And since that, I've had meetings with the police ministers' offices. In fact, I've got another one in another state coming up in about 2 weeks' time. I've got New South Wales Police. We're setting up people to see us to see what we've done with Queensland Police. And I think it's one of those areas where people are always going on about the good and the bad and the ugly about AI. But if you can get AI to do some of the heavy lifting on the administration of policing, that is the paperwork, the stuff that keeps us in the office instead of out of the road, then it's a really good use case for it. And AI it's never going to be perfect, but let's face it, the genie's out of the box here. It's not going away. And if you don't leverage it and take advantage of it now, then you're going to be well behind everyone else.
As an old ex-copper sitting here listening to this, we were talking off air, comparing how things used to be to this. I mean, this is a massive, massive leap forward. And on so many levels, I mean, you take yourself back to being that young 18, 19-year-old copper going to the academy. No copper goes into the police academy to do paperwork. That's not the dream. And we're just chatting about this application to domestic violence. And of course, there are going to be much wider applications for all sorts. I mean, when we look at high-level investigations of homicide, things like that, it could greatly, greatly reduce the man-hours with regards to, the laborious sort of paperwork, briefs of evidence and things such as that.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting you talk about that, because I always had this thing when I was in the police, like especially as a detective going to a crime scene. I always thought, wouldn't it be really cool if, like Sherlock Holmes, like you walk into a room and things just pop out at you. You could see what no one else could see. Glow in the dark, and you'd find it and no one else could see it. And they go, you're just an amazing investigator, detective, Craig. That's fantastic. How do you do that? And I remember when we were deploying our first round of AI, and of course, it wasn't just around domestic violence, it was around any exhibits, any evidence, financial records. And suddenly that AI was doing exactly what I'd always dreamed of as if I could do myself. It was seeing things that I couldn't see. It was finding it in rapid amounts of time. It was summarizing the evidence. It was saying, look, if you're looking for how to prove this offence, I've already done it for you. You just need to go through, confirm what I've come up with, confirm those exhibits are there, and we're done. So here's your evidence. Now let's have a look at another crime. I always think of it like that whole concept of being as clever as Sherlock Holmes. And suddenly I've got Sherlock Holmes in my pocket and I can take him with me for any investigation I do now. And he's going to do all that work for me. And I just have to go through and review it, confirm it, and then we'll be streamlining the criminal justice process in like no time at all.
I read through your bio, Craig. I think you've got quite an affinity with Sherlock Holmes as a young bloke. You know, it's part of your pathway into the police. So it's quite interesting that your pathway out has reconnected. That I think even I think I'm right in saying the famous, and if I get it wrong, my apologies. The famous quote, "It's elementary, my dear Watson." I think links to a trademark of one of your software products, does it not?
So that's true. It's a bit corny, but so we call it elementizing evidence. Is what I call the methodology behind our platform. And yeah, unfortunately, it's a bit cheesy, but it does kind of come from that thing. You know, it's elementary, my dear Watson. There's an interesting story about that whole term, elementizing evidence. I actually gave a presentation of Comtrac to the Director of Public Prosecution's office, and I was talking about this concept of elementizing evidence. And I remember the Director of Public Prosecutions said, "Now, you know, elementizing is not actually a real word, don't you, Craig?" I said, "Yeah, I know, I made it up." But I said, "But you Google it now, and it starts coming up everywhere." I said, "There's nothing cooler than potentially creating your own verb, right? Kind of like Uber. Like, I'd love to have my own verb out there. It's just like, oh, how do you build your briefs? Well, we elementize it. How do you do it?"
Yeah. Look, just to come back to that DV stuff, domestic violence, because this is such a massive part of policing. Some of the listeners may be surprised here. You know, you mentioned Logan, where perhaps in one shift there were 40 domestic violence cases that were red jobs on the go that couldn't be attended to. We know here, for example, in New South Wales, here in Sydney, west of Sydney, up to 70% of jobs attended by general duties police are domestic violence jobs. If we just apply this process that you're talking about just purely to domestic violence alone and nothing else, that's just going to free up so much more with regards to having police on the roads doing what the communities want them to do, to be there, to attend jobs, and also possibly take away from some that reluctance to take a few steps down that process because they know they're going to be stuck back in the station in the muster room for the rest of the shift having to go through paperwork.
The problem is generally when things go bad, especially in the frontline policing, police are always the punching bag. The reality is it's generally not their fault. Often it's just resourcing and the process that have been put in place to actually do things. When we ran that proof of concept with the Queensland Police, the feedback that they were sending back was the AI was picking up things that I'd forgotten. So it's picking up evidence and comments that they can use to justify an application that they'd forgot because there's a lot of emotion going on at those scenes. They're not always, everyone's talking nicely to each other. Oh, we just had an argument. Don't worry about it. And so to have to remember everything that was said without the assistance of going through that video is really difficult. And the pressures are on police to get those applications right and have all the information in it. Because, and we've heard it before in the news, right? There people get issued domestic violence orders, what do they call it in other states? I think AVOs. And there might be one or two, and then sometimes it's led to a homicide or someone being killed or seriously hurt. So it's important right from the start they get it right to start with, right? And some of the feedback we got from the Queensland Police, the proof of concept was, like I said, number one, the AI is picking up things that I hadn't thought of. But they also said things like the pressures that have been taken off me, knowing that this was going to be done initially by AI and me just to review it, it meant I could spend more time with the actual aggrieved at the scene. Because I knew that I wasn't going to be 3 or 4 hours of my shift doing paperwork. I could spend more time there. And there's some of the feedback that we hadn't really thought of when we were running it. So it was interesting to get that sort of feedback as well, where the pressures have been taken off them. And the reality is, again, police attrition rate is high across the whole country in every state. And where it used to be like a career, the police, you join when you're 19 and a lot of people go through to 50 or 60, right? That's not happening anymore. You've got young police who are coming into the job, they're going on the road in their first year and they're going from domestic violence incident to domestic violence incident, been sitting in front of computers doing 3 or 4 hours of paperwork, and at some point they go, this is not what I thought it was. And that's the reality of it. We've got to do things a bit better. I mean, we need to have police freed up to be back on the front line. Look, I remember when I was in the Cairns Police, you'd be driving around 3/4 your shift just hoping to get a job. But we're always out in the street, right? And then you get one and you'd be back at the station. Now you just don't see police out on the road anymore because they're just drowning in paperwork and processes. I don't know about you, but I rarely see a uniform marked car when I drive to work and drive home again. It's a changed place.
We go back to our day, we had typewriters, which some of the younger listeners wouldn't even know what we're talking about, and we had to do typing tests at the academy. Those were the days where you'd do an interview of a suspect and you would actually record the interview in handwriting, by hand, because none of us were good enough typists to be able to type as they were chatting. And you'd send that handwritten statement upstairs to the typing pool. And in our station, the person who could put the best briefs together was the head typist because she does it for everybody. And so what you sent up would be all changed, and it'd be like your school teacher, your English teacher going through and changing all your words and all your spelling mistakes. And so to sit here and to listen to what you've done and the connection to AI, it's really quite incredible. I mean, it's a massive leap forward that we've taken in a relatively short period of time, the last 4 or 5 years. And I think you're right. There is a reluctance, a fear, a lack of knowledge around AI, and we tend to emphasise the potential bad sides of and all that type of thing. But this really puts a spotlight on some real positive stuff, doesn't it?
I was on a panel last year for the ANSPA conference, which is the National Australian New Zealand Policing Association conference. It's one of the biggest policing conferences in the country, and I was invited to be a part on an emerging technology panel. And of course, we talked about what we had done with the Queensland Police project. We spoke about that and use of AI to streamline all this administrative paperwork. And at the end of it, they invite us to say a couple more closing remarks. And my comments were that throughout the conference, I'd heard a lot about AI, and I heard a lot of people saying how it can be used really well, but there was a lot of people talking about where it falls short or why they're reluctant to go down that path. And I said to them at the end of that panel, to my closing address, was that if I came to you and I said, I've got the cure for cancer, but I can only cure about 90% of it, would you really tell me, go away until it's absolutely perfect? We're not interested because there's a risk that 10% of it might not survive. And of course, the answer was, well, no. You'd say, yeah, if we can save 90% of people from cancer, let's just do it. And AI it's not that much different. It's like, it's not going to be perfect, but if we can make you 90% more efficient, and that other 10% just means you've got to have some things in places to check it, to accept that it's there to assist. It's not going to be perfect, and let it do some of the heavy lifting. You're going to be far better off. And if you sit back and go, I'm not going to do this until maybe 10 years down the track where AI has been proven to be perfect, then imagine all the opportunity costs that are going to have been lost to your agency in that period of time. And yeah, so it's something. Look, so when we built our platform, we purposely watched carefully all the national frameworks for government using AI. We have built our AI platform around those national frameworks. And they're not that complicated. It's really just about making sure the human is involved. There's an audit trail of where the AI got the result from. Human has to sign off on it. That you can control your model through configuration in the back end, all that sort of stuff. And it's all there, and it's growing. And look, I couldn't be more excited about the benefits it can bring to the community, to law enforcement, and that whole dream that I have of streamline the criminal justice process, which is where it all started. It's like it's so real now, and it's just on our doorstep that we can make things better. Potentially, in due course, we'll start putting a few of those defence criminal lawyers out of work, or just get them a little bit of work at the end.
And to me too, there's a parallel, and it's probably a bit of a clunky one, but there's a parallel here to, again, back in the day, where police records, police databases went from being basically hard copy paper to being computerised. So you could drive around in a patrol car, you could do a QVR, query vehicle registration on the run, you could put it through to dispatch, and they could come straight back who the owner was with any warrants or anything like that. Where a couple of years prior to that, that would be a message that was sent back to the station, then a message to somebody who would go and find the file and go through it, and then eventually sort of get back to you. So computerising the policing system back in the 80s, it didn't create knowledge that didn't exist. It just expedited and streamlined the process. Is that a reasonable parallel to what we're seeing now in your system with AI? It's not creating anything that doesn't exist. It's just expediting and streamlining a process which has become a bit clunky.
I guess when you think about it, even before AI, everyone was using Google to look up things, right? They're looking for answers through Google. In its own way, Google's doing a lot of the work of researching for you anyway and giving you some information back, and then you had to do something with it. So AI in its own ways is almost like Google on steroids. It's not only is it doing that research for you, it's got access to information, but it's putting it back in a way that's easy to digest and that you can actually utilize it. The benefits of it are just, you can't argue with it. If you're coming up with arguments why you should never use it, especially in law enforcement, then you're probably making it up. It all comes down that the human has to own the result, right? So at the end of whatever the AI brings back to you, you've got to accept the unit. So the risk is that the human at the other end won't read it and won't look at it and will save it, even though they've passed all the acknowledgement gateway saying, I've read it and all sorts of stuff. And you know what? That potentially will happen anyway. Like, there's all different people. Some people like to take shortcuts. One of the key things we did when we factored into Comtrac is, like, technically speaking, we could get our platform, and it doesn't because we purposely didn't go as to look at all the evidence being gathered and just build the brief in its entirety for you. But we purposely don't do it like that. We basically go, you take one exhibit, the AI will look at that, it'll map it against the elements of the offence, you read it, and you move on to the next one. Because if we just said select all exhibits and do the mapping, that's what's going to happen. People will get lazy and they won't read it properly. So you've got to maintain that risk, right? So we purposely don't allow it to do that. That risk has always existed with humans, right? They'll come up with something, create a court brief and arrest brief. They'll put a summary of what they think they know about the investigation and put it to court. And often they're taking shortcuts there as well. But sure, what I can tell you is that the one thing about the AI, especially if, like, you've got to configure it right, you've got to make sure it's said, you can't hallucinate, this is your role, whatever you come back to, circle back in, double check it, and bring me back a reference where it came from. Once it's doing that, at least you know your AI is not making anything up. It's factual. It's like having that investigative partner working with you who knows absolutely everything there is to know about this case. You know, because me as an investigator, I might know a lot of it, but I'm unlikely to know everything. Whereas my AI partner knows absolutely everything about this investigation, every word spoken, every exhibit taken, every fact and figure, and it will find evidence quicker and present evidence a lot faster than I can do it. And it can even do it without any opinions. I don't know about you from your history, but sometimes you went to court and then the defense going, I'm not interested in your opinion, detective. And you go, you're right, that was my opinion. Whereas your AI, again, it's configured to make sure it just states the facts, leaves out any opinion-related matters. It just makes sense.
Craig, I just want to thank you so very much for joining us via our studio up there in Queensland. Craig, it's not only talking about your time in the police, and can I just say too, the 22 years, thank you for your 22 years of service to the good people of the state of Queensland, but also at the back end of the chat there, I was so interested in the advancements through your software company, Comtrac, and the work that they're doing, and I have absolutely no doubt that this will result in a massive increase in capacity of police throughout Australia if state and federal or state and territory policing are open to taking this on board. I just see it as a wonderful development. And Craig, thank you for your time here today. Thanks for the work that you've done, and I really look forward to keeping an eye on this and where it moves into in the future.
No, not at all. Thanks. I really enjoyed it.
Our guest this week was Craig Doran. His company is called Comtrac, and you can learn more about the work he does at comtrac.com.au. Join us next week for another episode of Crime Insiders Forensics. It will be in your feed early Monday morning.